This is Graphic Design 1, Project 1. So this is about point, line, and plane. All right, this project is my favorite project that I get to teach. It is essentially, we're teaching about abstraction. And I'm sure several of you have done a project like this in the past. This project is primarily based on the teachings of Wassily Kandinsky. Does anyone in here know who Wassily Kandinsky is or has ever heard of him? Okay, we got one. That's all right. That's okay. So we're going to explore who he was and sort of what his style was and how that pertains to this project. So you'll see his spelling of his name spelled two different ways. He was Russian, and here it's spelled with a W. Sometimes you'll see it with a V. It's really just based on the pronunciation of it, but it's Wassily Kandinsky. He was a painter, and he was the developer of this concept of point, line, and plane. He was from Russia, but ended up teaching as a teacher of the Bauhaus School of Art and Architecture in Germany. And that is his work in the back. He was born in Moscow, Russia in 1866. Became a law professor, like something you really wouldn't expect. He was a law professor up until like his mid-40s. You know, his upper age, not really thinking you're going to change careers at that point in your life, but he was very, very passionate about painting and felt really compelled to move in that direction. So he left being a law professor. And in 1921, at the age of 55, which is normally when you're eyeballing retirement, Kandinsky moved to Weimar, Germany to teach mural painting and introductory to analytical drawing at the newly founded Bauhaus School, right? And you guys just did your Bauhaus readings, right? I hope. So you should know, hopefully, how important the Bauhaus School was at that point in time. It was very, very significant teachings. So his presence there was really important, and it was really marked by his style of work. At the Bauhaus, Kandinsky developed theories on color, lines, points, and shapes. Analyzing various art forms, he reduced each to their simplest form in an effort to reveal their structures. He was fixated on simplifying things, not just shapes, but forms, movements, and even sound. His interpretation of sound is really prolific and really defined his work. His concept on movement, he really wanted the human form and break it down into the most simplistic things that he could break it down into. Kandinsky spent a lot of time translating the human form into points and into lines, and then also planes. So what he did was, he would photograph people in movement, all right? Then what he would do is he would break it down into the most simplistic forms that he possibly could. Here he's depicting her legs as just one single line, all right? This is her torso, and then her arms as also just being lines. So it was all about geometric shapes and forms. Then he broke down her feet. Her feet, or end of her toes, are just these 2 points. These are her hands, tiny little fingers, and then her head directly in the middle. These are other composite form drawings that he did based on movement. These are only lines. So his studies here were based on lines. Lots of hard angles, right? Lots of drawing with lines. Yes, Michael? Okay.
So have you ever seen hieroglyphs?
Have I ever seen?
Like hieroglyphs, and how some of them look
Oh,
like
hieroglyphics?
yeah.
Yes.
How some of them look like they're dancing.
Yeah.
Now, what if he was telling a story?
It's entirely possible. He may have been, I'm sure he had a very thorough education on art history, right? So in his mind, there may have been a very strong impact from hieroglyphics into his work. It's entirely possible. But yeah, I can see the relation there. So this was his study on movement, and you can see how each one of these studies relates back to the actual photograph that he took. One defining component to Kandinsky's work was his translation of sound and color. What was really profound about Kandinsky was that he was able to visualize music. And music to him also pronounced colors. He was able to see colors from music. It's a real actual condition that some people have. It's very rare, but some people have it, and he had it. Here he was able, well, not able, but he chose to take sheet music. Can anyone in here read sheet music or shape notes? Yes? Okay. It's really interesting when you look at this, how he was able to take the notation and then translate it into essentially dots, and the size of the dots, and how they're close together would be like staccato, right? Really sharp notes, and then showing a whole note and how that's pronounced and how it's sustained and it continues, right? It's really cool how you can see how he did that and how he chose to illustrate that as opposed to just going off how music is traditionally written. So, looking at how to visually translate an object, which is essentially going to be your project for project 1. You're going to be basing what you do off of Kandinsky's concept of breaking down objects into the most simplest forms, okay? You'll be choosing an object and breaking it down into very specific steps in order to create your final product, right? A lot of doing what he did by breaking things down is essentially, what we do now with logo design, right? Breaking things down into the simplest forms, understanding symbols, icons. That's a topic for another day, but this is the beginning form of that, all right? So first, you're going to be breaking your object down into a contour drawing. These are all going to be done in Illustrator, okay? So they're going to be all vectorized pieces. All right, the next thing you're going to be doing is identifying the points, all right? What points, right, or small objects within your larger object do you want to call attention to, all right? Taking a look at any points can be a circle, can be a square, can be a triangle. It can be a literal shape taken from your object. So maybe it's not a circle. Maybe it's part of a hubcap, right? Or part of a headlight on a car. But it needs to be 3/8 of an inch or smaller. And there's a reason for that, okay? These are examples of points. Now they look a little oblong because back in the day, all of this was done by hand. All right, so that's why they're like that. So be thankful you're not doing this project by hand, because students used to go through an ungodly amount of tracing paper. I'll just leave it there. So, okay, this one, I think this was a piano. So these were points on the piano. This was a guitar. I think this was also piano. So the goal here is to you're not necessarily tracing the object, right? We don't want to make a literal tracing of the outside. What you're doing is calling attention to important aspects of the object. Does that make sense? The difference there? One more time? I can't hear you, Michael. Yeah, kind of showing the negatives. It's kind of like, it's just breaking it down to its simplest forms, right? You're just calling attention to the most important. It could be a function that it does, right? Or it could just be like here on the piano, it's calling attention to the very tip of the baby grand piano, right? So now it's a physical aspect. Logan.
Like all these points and circles and stuff, they remind me a lot of those motion
Kind of like connect the dots?
No, like the motion traction thing, if you know what that looks like.
I don't know. You'll have to show me that one. I don't know if I know that one.
It's basically the same thing, but I'm using each dot in like important areas.
Yeah, you'll have to show me that one. It sounds interesting. Okay, and then moving on to line. So yes, you're doing your contour, right? But the contour is supposed to be really detailed. It's all about the literal form of your object, right? That's what a contour is. Taking lines into consideration, now you're just pulling out lines, just like Kandinsky did. So how he did those line drawings where it was just like, it was the woman's legs, right? And it was one line. That counts as a line study. The lines that he did where he was just drawing, you know, hieroglyphic like type shapes, like Michael said, right, about the other dancers. That's a line study. So it is a line without width, right? If it has width, it's actually a plane. That's why there's no width. It is an open or empty shape. So it can be a line that essentially makes a circle but doesn't close, right? Or it can be fully closed. So it's either or. It can be straight, curved, continuous, or broken. So essentially a dashed line also counts as a line. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, these are examples. So a literal interpretation of an object with curved or straight lines, partial or dashed lines are okay. All right. So this is the top of a piano. All right, this is the top, the lid essentially, for a baby grand. Baby grand? Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry, Michael, I can't hear you. Yes. Yeah, you'll see the examples towards the end a little bit more. But this is just showing you how to not necessarily take the entire object into consideration. What you want to do with each one of your drawings is to take into consideration that each one of these is going to be its own composition. Okay? You're making you're trying to make successful compositions with each frame, essentially, okay? With each layer that you guys do. This will make more sense as we go. But can anyone think back to maybe your art classes where you guys talked about composition and thinking about what were the important parts of a composition? Okay, Devin? Balance, yeah? Nicholas? You were going to say balance? Balance is a good one, you know, and it's kind of like, okay, well then how do I balance it, right? It's not necessarily going to be a symmetrical balance, right? Not necessarily symmetrical. It's all about that optimal balance. So it's all about the asymmetrical balance, right? What we do is very subjective. So it's about how this object over here could potentially balance out this object that's down here versus maybe there's a few little delicate pieces up here that are helping to balance out the whole form. Does that make any sense? Okay, so it's all about placement of objects, right? So when you're thinking about composition and you're thinking about how I'm going to draw these lines or make these points, also be taking into consideration the composition of each one. Does that make sense? Okay, and if it doesn't, let me know. The one in the middle is actually a metal staircase. And the farthest one on the right, you guys know what that is, yes? Not close, it's got wheels. It's a car, yeah. You were close. All right, now a plane, so it says a line with width, and the reason for that is because if it didn't have width, it'd be a line, right? A width means it's got some size to it. So now we're looking at planes. So now we're looking at larger shapes that can actually be filled to create that balance that you were talking about. Closed to become a solid shape. So what does a plane look like? These are planes, all right? You're going to be calling out large elements of your object, either in literal or abstract form. This is where that 3/8 of an inch comes into play. So a plane is going to be 3/8 of an inch or larger, right? because if it was smaller, it would just be a baby-sized point, all right? That's that difference. So this is a piano, obviously not a literal interpretation. This is more of an abstract interpretation. Here, these are two examples of the car. We've got a literal interpretation of the planes and an abstract interpretation of the planes, all right? So it's kind of nice to see those two right next to each other. Then you're going to be doing a high contrast, okay? You only have to do one because they're a bit intense. It's kind of nice to take your contour that you've already done. This is the beautiful thing about having it be a vector and it's in Illustrator. You can just copy that layer and move on with your life. Now you've got a template essentially that you can work with to create a high contrast, okay? That contour drawing is going to come in really handy for you if you can do as detailed as possible. So high contrast, this one is heavy with your shadows or low lights, which is why it's darker. It's got more blacks here and more low lights, versus this is a high contrast, but it's heavy on highlights. So now your goal is to interpret this either black or white. There's not going to be any gray areas. It's very straightforward, right? It's going to be one or the other. So you want to look at how can you interpret this image and make some decisions about what's going to be gray. Well, not gray. What is gray? How is it going to show up? Is it going to be black or is it going to be white? Right? So here we have two different examples. One, we're showing it on the left as being black, where we chose to actually call out the highlight, but we broke it up into two pieces. Does that make sense? Here, we chose to show it as a highlight on the right side, okay? So that's a high contrast. You probably will have questions when we come up to that one. That is, we'll address that when we get there. But really the goal here is to break down your object into black and white and how you want to interpret it. Another example of high contrast, this is the staircase and how a student chose to break it down into two separate high contrasts, right? So there's two different ways of doing it. Okay, now we're getting into the expressive stuff, all right? Expressive stuff tends to throw students off. They're like, well, what's the difference? So the expressive points that you're going to be doing, they're not so much accentuating maybe an important point or function within your object. What they're doing is they're expressing a function, right? Let's just say it's making a sound or it's making a movement. How can you show that by using points, lines, and planes? Devin. One more time. Can't hear you. Placement. Yeah, placement, for sure, right? Placement, how they interact with each other, right? Interaction really shows a lot of movement. So for instance, I'll tell you guys, the one on the left is implying sound coming out from the piano. All right, that's sound rising up. That was the intention here. The one in the middle was implying movement on the tire. It was on the outside of the tire the student had drawn, okay? Here, this was to imply steam coming up from the car. Does that make sense? So it's all about the placement, yes? Yeah. Scale can also imply different things as well, right? So like, for instance, Devin, what if we had larger points, which would be essentially planes, right? That would then feed into the smaller points, and that scale difference, right, would also create maybe even a more interesting composition by including scale. So these are expressive lines. Any idea what this one here is on the left? Devin? It's the piano, right? So this is all about the vibrations coming off of a piano. Any guesses in the middle? It's a car. Yeah, it's the headlight. It's the light coming off the headlights in the front. And then this is a little more abstract. This is more conceptual. What was that? Nope. This is actually reverb coming off a piano also. So this is all about sound. It's about the sound coming off of it, all right? And then we're going to do expressive planes. So expressive components call attention to a sound, a movement, or an action that is specific to your object, okay? Here, this student chose to just draw circles and add texture around the car, but you can see the wheels and the front of the headlight, right? So it's an expressive plane because she added texture to it, okay? Here, these are expressive points. Not points, expressive planes. They're small, but they're still planes. Expressive planes that were added to the staircase, okay? That's why they're spirally. And then this was the piano. So this was supposed to be essentially the foot, the bass pedals on the bottom that were basically, making that really loud sound from the bottom, if that makes sense to you guys. Okay. In the end, your goal is to create these combinations, okay? You're not reinventing the wheel. Once you get to this stage, you've already done all the work, okay? All you have to do is copy your layers, and you could even create folders in Illustrator. I can show you how to do this. So don't freak out if you're not sure how to do it. You can just create folders and call it combination 1 or combination 2, right? And inside those folders, you're just going to pull little pieces and parts from each of those combinations to create your finals. Does that make sense? Devin, does that make sense? What are you searching for? All right, and then anybody have an idea of what this is? Staircase, right? It's super abstract, right? But it's a nice composition. And so again, it comes back to that balance of balancing those heavy planes with the delicate lines and the delicate points. It's all about composition, weight, balance, all right, when compiling our finals, all right? Does that make sense? And then in the end, you get to do some little color studies, right? Kandinsky loved color. He was very passionate about color. And I think it's important to be able to add color in a more subtle way, right? Because we really want to pay homage to the contrast that we've already created. But including color is an important step. So you get to add color studies at the very end.